Hi, I'm Peggy Oliveira. Welcome to Courageous Journeys. If you're new to me, welcome. I'm happy to have you here. And if you're not, I'm so glad to have you back. Today's video is going to be a bit of a follow-up to the one that I did last week in regards to a question somebody had about whether the relationship that you have with your abuser should impact you more overall. And I wanted to expand on that this week because while I believe that it is true that the long-term impact on your sense of self is pretty much the same regardless of who your abuser or abusers may be, there are nuanced aspects of that that I think are important. And so I'm going to talk about that more this week. So in that video, I've talked about layers of wounding. And for example, specifically, it was about the idea of a father being your abuser. If your father is your abuser, then that adds another layer of the wounding. It adds another layer of healing. In fact, it might even add a few layers of healing. So when there is interpersonal violence, and what I mean by that, at any age really, is being hurt or traumatized by another human being, the interpersonal aspect of that. And the truth is that most people who experience childhood sexual abuse, there is an actual relationship. It's not just being harmed by another human being, it's being harmed by somebody that you have a relationship with. Even if it's just somebody that you somewhat know, there's still an aspect of relationship there. And so the nature of the relationship you have with your abuser adds layers. The more trust you have with that person, it adds layers. The more you have to rely on that person, the more layers. The more you have to be around that person, it adds layers. If it's somebody who is a stranger or somebody that you really have no relationship with at all, there aren't as many layers in terms of impact or healing. But ultimately, what you end up believing about yourself is pretty much the same. So I want to talk about that a little bit. I've shared this before, but I want to talk about it here because it's very pertinent to this. The long-term impact of childhood trauma, the catalyst, the instigator of the impact is the trauma. But the long-term impact has to do with what we believe about who we are, what we believe and expect from the world around us. That experience causes us to believe something, that the world is unsafe, that we can't trust people, that we as individuals are bad or responsible. We end up feeling shame. So these are all ideas, ultimately thoughts that we have. We hold on to those, and most of the time we're not aware that we're holding on to them. So they're not in our conscious awareness. But we end up attaching a meaning to those experiences. And the meaning is quite often, I've done something to cause this. This person doesn't love me. If we have an expectation or an idea that they should, this person clearly doesn't love me. I must have done something wrong or bad for this person to do this to me. And ultimately, that leads you to a place of feeling unworthy, undeserving, unlovable, bad, dirty. You struggle with relationships because trust and fear play a huge role in that. So all of those things are true, really pretty much regardless of who it is that abuses you, how many different people abuse you, or how many times you've been abused. What you believe about yourself is pretty much the same. However, the layers of impact do influence how we move through the world. They influence the pieces of evidence we go to prove what we already believe. So for example, if you are abused by a mother or a father, physically or sexually, or emotionally, any other type of abuse, but if you're abused by your parent, one or many of the layers, there's going to be multiple layers here, but some of the layers is, this is somebody that you have to live with. So that creates layers of ongoing fear, inability to trust yourself, inability to trust others. And one of the things that you're going to take from that is, if my own mother or father can do this to me, what does that say about me? Now again, as a child, you're not consciously thinking about that. Or it's not something that you necessarily really pay that much attention to, but it's an ongoing question. And of course, anytime we ask ourselves a question, we're going to have an answer. It's not going to be a truthful answer, but it's going to be the only answer we can come up with as a child. But when you ask yourself, how could my mother do this to me? Or what does it say about me that my own father could do this to me? Well, your answer is going to be, I must be really horrible. I must be completely unlovable if my own mother or father doesn't love me enough or can't love me enough to not hurt me in this way. And again, what you're saying to yourself may sound a little bit different than that, but it's ultimately kind of the bigger meaning that's going to be there. And if you're asking yourself, what does it say about me that my own mother or father could do this? Well, you're going to come up with things like, well, I must be being punished for something. I must be a really bad person. Because if my own mother or my own father doesn't love me, then I am unlovable. If they can't love me and protect me and care for me and not hurt me, then nobody else could possibly ever. So those are some additional layers that are going to be there, versus if it's a stranger or somebody that's a family friend that you really have no actual relationship with. Now, again, you're still going to believe ultimately on some level that you're probably unworthy. You're still going to feel shame. You're still going to somehow feel responsible. All those things are still going to be there. And that's what I mean ultimately by we're impacted the same. But if it's somebody like that, you're not going to have those added layers of having an expectation that this person should feel a certain way about you, that this person should actually protect you, that you should be able to be safe with that person. So in your child mind, the impact, the layers that are created are fewer. Now, again, that doesn't mean how you feel or how you struggle is going to be less necessarily at all. But when you think about it, you're not going to have those pieces of, well, if this stranger can abuse me, then what does that say? Now, you could still actually say that to yourself, but it's going to feel different than if it's your mother or father or your sibling. And there's differences there too in terms of what you're going to hold on to about that. So then as you go through life and you are feeling unworthy or undeserving of something, if it's a close person that you've had to trust or rely on, your evidence that you're going to go to is, well, clearly I'm undeserving because my own mother or father didn't love me enough. That's going to be what you go back to, because that's the belief you're going to take from that. That's the message that you are internalizing as a result of that. Again, you may not be conscious of that, but it's still present. And that is harder to heal. There are multiple layers there that require healing. If it's a stranger or a family friend, the evidence that you go to for why you're undeserving will still potentially, most likely be because you caused this abuse in your mind. You feel like you caused it. But you don't have those added layers of, my own mother couldn't love me. My own father did this to me. My own mother or father think this about me. So those ideas that we hold about that add layers. Another example is if it happens one time versus many times. Again, your sense of self in terms of long-term impact, what you believe about who you are and what you believe about the world around you, it's going to be pretty much the same. But if you have been abused one time, then you're going to have one experience that you keep going back to as proof of what you believe about yourself. Like all your shame, well, maybe not all your shame in your entire life, but the biggest piece of shame that you carry that creates shame in lots of other areas ultimately too, is going to be about this one experience. Now again, that's internally just as impactful. You are likely going to feel just as much shame as anybody else, but you have this one thing that you go back to prove in your mind that you have something to be ashamed of. If you've had a lot of abuse experiences or even 2 abuse experiences, then it gives you more proof. So layers. If you have been abused many times in your life, then when you think about being responsible for it, or for example, one of the things that people hold on to in terms of feeling responsible is I didn't say no, or I didn't fight back, or something like that. Well, if it happened one time, you're still going to feel that, you're still going to internalize it, but you have one specific time that you go back to time and time again as proof. If it happens over time and you didn't say no, and again, keep in mind that children don't say no. It's very rare for a child to say no, and there are a lot of reasons for that. But if there are multiple times that it happened and you didn't say no any of those times, then when you are thinking about, when you are feeling into that sense of being unworthy or being responsible, being bad, and that's why all these things happened, then you're going to have a lot of different examples that you can point to as proof. And that's the layering, or at least in part, that's the layering. Because instead of having one example, you've got many examples. And the same is true if you've had more than one abuser, which is also very common. If you have one abuser, you're still ultimately going to feel just as responsible as somebody that has more. If you have one abuser versus more, you're still going to feel your experience of shame with that is going to be very much the same as somebody else who's had more than one abuser. The difference is that you will look at, you have this one person that you go to and feel like you've done something wrong, or whatever it is that you're saying to yourself. If you have multiple abusers, then in your mind, there's more proof that you really are the bad one. And that was my own thinking, because when I had one abuser, I still felt at fault. I still felt like I was doing something. I still felt like it says something about me, that somehow I was being punished. But it was one abuser in the beginning. And when I ended up having subsequent abusers, well, with each subsequent abuser, I remember actually thinking, well, now it's definitely my fault. This proves it beyond a shadow of a doubt that it really is me. And then the next time, okay, well, now clearly it's me. So, but the long-term impact on how I felt about myself and who I am and who I could be in the world, that was created after one abuser. But each additional abuser added layers of me being able to prove that I really was horrible. So then in healing, you have to recognize how many different layers proved in your mind what you believe to be true. So another example is if, like, the degree of abuse. So there's a spectrum of behavior that can happen in terms of abuse, and people compare their abuse to other people's abuse all the time. But if you're somebody on a spectrum where a lot of different kinds of things happened, or more what some people might consider severe types of abuse, you might be on this end of the spectrum. But again, what you end up believing about yourself is going to be pretty much the same, whether you're on this end of the spectrum or this end of the spectrum. But if you're on this end of the spectrum where a lot of different kinds of things happened, or again, and I'm putting this in quotes because it's not a good way to define it, but I think generally people will define it this way, like the severity. If you've got a lot of different kinds of things, or I'm just trying to be mindful of how I'm saying this, because it would be very easy for somebody to take this and minimize their own experience, and nobody's experience should ever be minimized. But for people that somebody might identify has more severe abuse, that adds a lot of layers, because if somebody touched you one time, not minimizing that, because again, I'm going to keep saying this, the long-term impact on how you feel about who you are as an individual being is going to be the same. It's going to leave you with the same ideas about yourself. But if somebody touches you one time, you have one thing to go back to, which is devastating enough. And again, the long-term impact in terms of how we cope, in terms of how we feel about who we are, how we can show up in relationships, kind of the same. But when you've had a lot of different types of abuse experiences that have ranged in so-called severity, and the reality is that, again, it's the layering. It's the potential physical pain that is very real. It's the fear that you have about being injured or not surviving. Like, obviously, those are very traumatic types of things that are going to add to the way the trauma affects mostly your body, more so than your mind and your sense of self. But if you've had these multiple types of abuse experiences, then you have many different things that you can point to as proof instead of one thing that you can point to as proof. So in terms of the impact, there's the layering of that impact. And one example kind of to talk about in terms of this end of the spectrum, and this isn't necessarily about the spectrum of abuse, but how we can think about it, is having a same-gendered abuser. So one of the things that happens when your abuser is the same gender, is it can add the layer of, am I gay and don't know it? What did I do to make this person think I was gay? Because of course we think about it as sex and not abuse. So it adds layers to what you believe about the experience. Where somebody who is abused by somebody of the opposite gender, that's not something that we necessarily think that anything about, because it doesn't give us something bad to think about, if that makes sense. We expect sexual things to happen between opposite genders, right? But when somebody is abused by the same gendered person, it can cause people, because it adds shame, it adds more questions that you might have about why. Now, your impact on sense of self in terms of who you believe you are, again, is going to be the same, but a layer that can certainly be added there, and I know this from my professional experience, is that it can cause people to question their own sexuality, again, feeling like somehow they must be secretly gay because they've put off these signals for this person to pick up on. So it adds those layers. And then when you heal, there are layers then that need to be healed. So I hope that helps understand, not just in terms of clarification from my last video, if you watched that and needed some clarification, but I also wanted to talk about it because it is the complexity of that layering that creates the length of time that it takes to heal, or that adds to the length of time that it takes to heal, because there are often many layers that need to be worked through. Another way that layers can show up is, what other kinds of things have wounded you? So for some people, maybe the majority of their life was really pretty good, but then they had the abuse. And that could even be true, like if you're being physically abused at home, you may have had friends, you may have had a great extended family. Now, granted, that's probably a little unlikely, but could still happen. So maybe that's not even the best example, but you could have some good things happening in your life outside of that. Now, in my experience, most people that have childhood abuse, typically there are a lot of other factors that are happening in the family and sometimes in the environment that are not very good. But you can have other aspects of your life that are going pretty well. Like you might not have any financial concern, or you might, or maybe the financial aspect, like having a good financial foundation in your family actually could create other problems. But maybe you're in a pretty safe community, or maybe you're not in a very safe community. Do you have a sibling that has a lot of issues, or do you have really supportive siblings? Do you have a lot of friends, or do you not have a lot of friends? So those pieces of your life also are going to create layers. So if you grow up poor, if you grow up in an environment that feels unsafe outside of your own home, that's going to add layers. If you have a parent with an addiction, that's going to add layers. If there's other forms of violence happening in the home, that's absolutely going to add layers. So there are a lot of different pieces of that, but even with all those different kinds of layers, again, what you ultimately take from that about who you are, what you believe about who you are, is going to be pretty much the same. But when it comes to healing, there's a lot of different pieces there that you need to work through, that you need to heal. So I hope that makes sense. I know that it can feel kind of confusing, but understanding the various layers to healing I think is important to recognize that there's a reason that healing takes the time that it does. There's a reason that there is so much hurt, pain, grief associated with it all. There's nothing wrong with you. There's just a lot to heal. So thank you for listening. If you've got any questions about this video, you can put them in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts, any reactions, anything that you notice coming up for you. Please share them. If you haven't subscribed, please be sure to do so, and make sure to click on the little bell to make sure you get notifications when I share a new video. Thank you for being here. And if you have a question that you would like me to answer, please send it to qanda@courageousjourneys.com. That's QANDA@courageousjourneys.com, and I will answer it on an upcoming Q&A video. Thanks again for being here. I'll look forward to seeing you next time.